in these last few days, we have gone through quite significant changes related to the tanks and to the healers. Blizzard philosophy changes on how they want tanks to play, how they want the damage coming to the tanks to work, and also how the healers are then supposed to be healing this tank damage. Now, while there is a lot of talk about this current situation between tanks and healers, there is one extra little thing tucked in a corner that perhaps too many players have been forgetting given the attention went on tanks and healers primarily, which is the currently only support spec in the game, Augmentation. Now, not much introduction need to be given to Augmentation ever since it was introduced into the game. We used to live in a happy world of balance and multiple choices, and then Augmentation came into the meta and completely dominated Mythic Plus. Blizzard had to go on a spree of nerfing Augmentation about 20 times to make them much less relevant towards the end of Season 3, and then in the beginning of this last season things went pretty much back to, I guess, normal from when Augmentation was introduced. And practically the same thing happened in the raid. Ever since Augmentation was introduced in Season 2, you had 2 Augmentation in world first kills of bosses in both Aberrus and Amirjasil. Now, while some players might see some positive, perhaps some good vibes towards the intended changes and the ideas Blizzard wants to bring for tanks, especially in Mythic Plus, there is of course a problem, because right now there exists in the game one spec, one particular spec whose buffs are not just a flat, for example, damage buff to the entire party or raid, for example, say a warrior giving Battle Shout, making you do more damage, or a demon hunter giving you 5% more magical damage. The buffs to Augmentation are a bit more specific, and one of the many reasons players have often considered these buffs to become a problem is because they buffed a couple of roles in ways no other major buff was able to do. For example, you have the mastery of Evoker, Time Walker, which already gives you versatility as a buff whenever you cast an Empower spell, which became a pretty big problem because, of course, with a lot of mastery you were able to get quite a lot of versatility, to the point that this was nerfed over time, because it used to be 2 allies with the base value of 4% scaling with mastery. Then it was nerfed to 1 ally and down to 3% mastery. It was nerfed by more than half of its power because of how good it was. But that wasn't just the only thing, right? Augmentation was also considered very powerful because it had something like Blistering Scales, which gave 30% more armor to the tank. Now, obviously, you start having more problems if Blizzard introduces a system where tanks start taking more damage, right? Where tanks are nerfed across the board. For example, you go over Druid and now their Iron Fur increases their armor by a smaller amount, right? So they take more damage because they have lower armor. But Augmentation is still there. Augmentation still exists to be able to give more armor to tanks, for example. Now, not only can they also give versatility to players, but of course they have Ebon Might, which gives you primary stat. That was one of the major buffs they could give to healers in high keys, to be able to give them more healing power to survive healing checks, and more importantly, more primary stat to tanks, which is another kind of unique buff that no other spec could bring, because tanks, unlike other specs where their primary stat, intellect or strength or agility, simply makes them do more damage, for tanks, they do more damage with their primary stat, but it also increases their defensives. To some tanks, it can increase their parry, it can increase their dodge, it can increase their block. It does also extra defensive things, not to mention certain tanks have, for example, Ignore Pain, which creates an Absorb Shield that is also based on your primary stat, or Guardian Druids have their Iron Fur based on their agility. So of course, having Ebon Might makes you stronger also in your defensives for a tank. And again, You have a situation where Blizzard wants to change the damage taken by tanks, wants to make tanks more squishy, not take nearly as many spikes of heavy damage, getting 1 or 2 shots, but make them take more consistent damage, so healers feel like they can help the tank as well. But all of this comes back to being a problem with the existence, of course, of augmentation. Because the weaker you make a tank, the stronger you make the need of having an augmentation evoker in your group, because it's still the one that can give these kind of buffs to the tank. Whether it is armor increase or primary stat increase or the versatility buff from their mastery or their cooldown Breath of Eons, with the follow-up Chrono Ward giving you a massive shield. So players have gotten a bit worried about the value, the power level of Augmentation Evoker getting into the War Within. So a few of the changes to Augmentation have been increasing their personal power, as you can see from the log results from the raid. Augmentation is no longer what we saw at the very beginning of the introduction of Augmentation, where they were fighting tank level damage. Then Warcraft logs added more and more hooks to be able to count all of the buffs that Augmentation was giving out as their damage. But now, even in the beta, they have far higher, damage compared to what they had before. Because, of course, Blizzard had to try to constantly nerf the buffs damage that they gave to players, so their other damage, their actual abilities, had to start doing some more damage. But the value of their buffs are still there. And this is seen somewhat as a problem right now, getting into the War Within, because there is a risk, right? We have at this point, this is not something that is only for one season, right? Players start getting scared at the end of Shadowlands, for example. Oh god, if Blizzard doesn't change anything, we are going to get Blood Death Knight, Holy Priest, Destruction Warlock, and Survival Hunter in all groups in the next expansion. In the case of Augmentation, we have a very clear situation. Ever since it was created, it was paired with Fire and with Shadow. And then Blizzard destroyed Shadow Priest by nerfing, first of all, their damage, but also the way Mind Soothe and Mastery Spell worked. So Shadow was replaced by Havoc. With the growth of Vengeance, there was less of a need of Havoc, so it was replaced by a mix of Shadow and the recently buffed and reworked Red Paladin. And then by the start of the last season, we are back to Augmentation Fire and Shadow with Vengeance as a tank. And this dominant composition, this particular dominant composition, is starting to give players some worries, because even if you go back to BFA and the dominance of certain specs for the entire expansion, for example Outlaw, as you see here, and even Havoc, both Outlaw and Havoc becoming the dominant picks in BFA. Once you get into Shadowlands, Outlaw and Havoc are not, really a thing. In fact, Shadowlands was mostly balanced, and then even with Survival and Destro, at the end of Shadowlands, once you enter Dragonflight, Survival and Destro are nowhere to be seen. This level of consistency for so long has been going on with these specs in particular, now also tied with Vengeance. This becomes a problem in particular because you have Fire Mage giving you 5% basically more damage because you have 5% more intellect, which is given to Shadow and to Augmentation because they are casters. Then you have Resto also giving you 3% versatility, and then you have Vengeance, which gives you more magical damage to all these three specs. So you have 5% more damage, 5% more damage, 3% more damage. You have a comp which can give you 13% more damage done to the 3 DPS, which is at the moment unbeatable. In terms of buffs, there is no other comp that can give you these many damage increases to a single group of players. On top of this, you also have Power Infusion, and on top of Power Infusion, you also have, of course, the general buffs that the support class Augmentation can give, whether it is the Inferno's Blessing, the crit from Prescience, the Mastery, versatility buff, the main stat of Ebon Might, or the cooldown of Breath of Eons. And the problem is that Augmentation will be at the center of this comp, because, for example, one of the easily replaceable in the comp is Shadow Priest, which can be replaced by a different, better performing DPS spec, or even Restoration Druid, which could be replaced by Resto Shaman, now that, for example, Resto Shaman has a proper raid buff that can also give some extra damage to the rest of the group. But the one that is a staple remains Augmentation. Augmentation can be so polarizing right now that there could be talks of changing the meta just based on the cooldown of their big DPS cooldown, Breath of Eons. Because generically, Augmentation can run or generally runs with the 10% cooldown reduction. So usually you want to line up a 2-minute cooldown with Breath of Eons, right? With Interwoven Threads, the cooldown goes down to 108 seconds, and then they run Scale Commander, which has Wing Leader. Bombardments reduce the cooldown of Breath of Eons by 1 second per target hit, up to 3 seconds of CDR per bombardment, which can bring Breath of Eons down to a 90-second cooldown. So now suddenly specs with a 90-second cooldown become significantly more relevant if Augmentation is meta. For no other reason, the spec with 2-minute cooldown and the spec with 90-second cooldown are just as strong. Maybe even the one with the 2-minute cooldown CD is slightly stronger, but because of the lining up of cooldowns with Augmentation, the meta is shifted in favor of specs with 90-second cooldowns. And it is a good example to make with the current meta build with Shadow Priest. Right, Shadow Priest is centered around Void Eruption, which has a 2-minute cooldown, which cannot be reduced. You have no way to move away from this 2-minute cooldown. So if Evoker goes down to a 90-second cooldown, you are now much weaker as a Shadow Priest. Meanwhile, Fire Mage has a 2-minute cooldown Combustion, but they have both Kindling and Unleashed Inferno to significantly reduce the cooldown of Combustion easily below 90 seconds. So they can line it up with an Augmentation Evoker burst. And even the newly reworked, currently super powerful Arcane, guess the timing of their cooldowns. 90 seconds for Arcane Surge, 90 seconds for Evocation, perfectly lining up with Augmentation Evoker's Scale Commander cooldown of Breath of Eons. So it does polarize the power, for example, of a composition in Mythic Plus just based on who gets to line up the best with Augmentation Evoker, for example. So a Shadow Priest with a 2-minute cooldown PI and a 2-minute cooldown Void Eruption would lose a lot more compared to a Mage with a 90-second cooldown, or a Warlock with 90-second cooldowns, for example. And that is still just based on the damage. Because, some players are saying that there is a simple solution that Blizzard is trying to achieve to fix this problem. And that is what they mentioned also about the tank damage. The fact that if we had a Mythic Plus key finally tuned around doing damage rather than surviving damage taken, Augmentation would lose a lot of value. Because Augmentation doesn't have the best damage. Not even close to having the best AoE damage. So if you suddenly created a meta situation where the most important thing to time a very high key was DPS. We can survive with our own defensives, we can survive with our own healer. We're not taking a lot of spiky one-shot level damage, we are taking a lot of rot damage, and we can do it with our own healer and our own defensive, so Augmentation is not needed purely for defensives. Then Augmentation could start losing in pure AoE damage. They would lose to Destro, maybe to Arms, maybe to Frost, to Retribution Paladin, to Marksmanship Hunter, so suddenly they would no longer be this dominant. However, as long as the meta isn't about who does the most damage, but rather the meta is who gets to survive long enough to do enough damage, then that is where we have seen Augmentation become so powerful. This was the key word of the entire expansion, being able to survive one-shot mechanics once you reached certain high enough levels, and that's also where players realized Augmentation was helping you a lot. Whether it was at the very high level, the Absorb Shield given from Rescue, the damage reduction given from Zephyr, the extra HP given from Draconic Attunement's active effect, the tankiness given to the tank, plus the max primary stat for tankiness given to the tank, as well as more healing given to the healer, the versatility buff given to the healer and tank and the rest of the DPS through their mastery, as well as the crit extra given. So all this combined helped in ways no other spec could in terms of trying to survive in a Mythic Plus key. So if Blizzard was able to shift the amount of damage you take, away from one-shot mechanics and more from rot damage, thicken damage that gives you time to react, give you time to heal as a healer, for example, it would reduce the value, it would reduce the power and the influence that augmentation has in the power of a Mythic Plus group, for example. And that is kind of the worry players have now. The worry that even with these changes given to tanks and the extra slight changes given to the single target power of the heals of healers, we are still inevitably going to end up in this one-shot scenario. And in this one-shot scenario, augmentation will continue to be the main choice in your group. This is almost, it's almost a given in the raid. There is practically no hope that this will change in the raid and you will still run double Augmentation Evoker even in the next raid in the War Within, because spiky, bursty, very dangerous damage will absolutely happen in a Mythic raid, so Augmentation will have their comfy spot there. It's more about Mythic Plus, because Mythic Plus is much more punishing, because the only spots for an Augmentation are in the DPS and there is only 3 spots, but Augmentation is the only one support spec you can choose. So if the one spec for support is always Augmentation, you're cutting the options of a DPS to be meta by a gigantic amount, right? By 33%, because you lose 1/3, 1/3 of your possible spots as a DPS are now taken by Augmentation. If previously in other metas you could have been, well, we need one spec with Bloodlust in this comp, we need one spec with Combat Res in this comp, I guess this one can be who does the best DPS, and this one who does the second best DPS. Now this option is blocked. You don't have the DLC, you don't have the support spec DLC, and it is now taken exclusively by Augmentation, which is going to heavily restrict the amount of DPS specs that could be viable. And this can have an effect even in so-called God comps or Exodia comps, for example. Many players remember the power of what happened at the end of Shadowlands, right? This power, where Holy Priest, Blood Decay, Survival and Destruction were the main choices. However, one spot was free, and you can see here Windwalker for a bit, but also Outlaw, and then some Frost Mage, and then the season after some Fire Mage. You even had some space for some Fury Warriors early on for Marksmanship Hunters. So the fact that you only had 2 top tier DPS specs gave you room to try out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 other DPS specs. However, when this happens, when this level of power happens for a single comp, the rest of the specs get squished much more with the power of Augmentation. And that's kind of the fear some players are having with the coming of the first season of the War Within. Because yes, we are seeing some attention given to the state and the power level of tanks. We are following up with the changes given to the healers to make up with these changes for tanks. But while all of this is happening, not much is being changed for Augmentation. And that is kind of the worry. We already know that nerfing the percentages of their buffs has not done much. Their mastery has been cut by like 70% in power. Their stamina buff that they used to have on Aspect's Favor and their Draconic Attunements buff has been nerfed by like 80%. The damage share on Breath of Eons and the Absorb Shield of Breath of Eons has also been nerfed, as well as of course the primary stat given to Ebon Might has been nerfed by over 60% as well. Nothing changed. The value, the power has still been there for Augmentation, and that is the fear for the first season of the War Within, that not much attention, or rather perhaps no idea of what to do in Blizzard's minds on what to do with Augmentation and their current level, their current power when it comes especially with Mythic Plus in mind. So hoping that this will not be a Doomium manifesto in a few weeks and we will indeed start seeing the domination of Augmentation in Mythic Plus keys again. That was the point for today. The worry about the current state and power level of Augmentation possibly bleeding in the next expansion as well, which will be a very bad hit for all the DPS specs now finding themselves much less likely to be played, and also on a side note, also a bad thing for Preservation Evoker, which would have also even fewer chances of being played once another spec of their class is viable and meta in Mythic Plus. This was the quite depressing point for today on this Saturday. I'm going to leave you with your takes on the current state of Augmentation Evoker and what could be done to fix this problem as we leave each other, starting of course with the goodbyes and the thanks for having watched the video, as well as for supporting in any other free way, such as liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, weather check. For today we have at least gone down 3 degrees, although from 35 to 32 there is not too much to be happy about.